What if I told you? People rarely say the truth about their past, but their behavior always does. In the first few minutes, the smallest reactions, eye movements, pauses, and even comfort with silence start revealing more than words ever could. Attraction isn't random, it's patterned. And in dating, there are subtle psychological signs that expose emotional history, attachment style, and hidden experiences without a single confession. Most people miss them because they're not looking deep enough. But once you understand these signals, you'll never see dating the same way again. What you often notice in people isn't always what they say. It's what slips through when they are not trying. Every human being carries a quiet emotional history, built from past connections, disappointments, trust, loss, and learning. And even though words can be controlled, rehearsed, and polished, behavior has a way of revealing patterns that were never meant to be spoken aloud. When you start observing people closely, not to judge them, but to understand how the mind works, you begin to realize something powerful. No one enters a connection as a blank page. Every reaction is shaped by something written before. In the earliest moments of interaction, micro-reactions often speak the loudest. A slight pause before answering, a shift in eye contact, a subtle change in tone. These are not random. They are reflections of emotional conditioning built over time. When someone has been through repeated emotional highs and lows, their nervous system learns patterns of protection and openness. So even in casual conversation, you may see hesitation where confidence should be, or unexpected ease where caution might be expected. These tiny signals are not proof of anything specific, but they do reveal how the mind has been shaped by experience more than intention. As conversations deepen, boundaries begin to show something even more meaningful. The way a person responds when limits are discussed, whether emotional, personal, or social, can quietly reflect their understanding of trust and respect. Some people naturally navigate boundaries with calmness, while others react with discomfort or resistance. This is often not about the present moment alone, but about what they have previously experienced in relationships where boundaries were either respected or ignored. Over time, the mind learns what to expect from closeness, and those expectations quietly surface in new interactions. Then there is silence, something most people try to avoid but few understand. The way someone handles silence can reveal more than constant talking ever will. For some, silence feels safe, almost grounding, as if there is no pressure to perform. For others, silence creates discomfort, pushing them to fill every gap with words, jokes, or distraction. This difference often reflects emotional independence versus emotional dependency patterns developed over time. A person who is comfortable with silence usually has a stable inner world, while someone who struggles with it may be unconsciously seeking reassurance or validation through constant engagement. As you observe further, you may notice inconsistencies in how people share their stories. Not necessarily lies, but subtle shifts in emphasis, details, or order. Memory is not a fixed recording, it is deeply influenced by emotion. People remember what impacted them emotionally, and sometimes unconsciously reshape details based on how they felt, rather than what exactly happened. This is why storytelling can sometimes feel slightly different each time. It is filtered through emotion, not just fact. These variations are not always signs of dishonesty, but reminders that human memory is more psychological than mechanical. Another layer appears in those who seem overly smooth, overly aware, or carefully composed in social situations. At first, this can look like confidence, but sometimes it is the result of learning through experience. When someone has navigated complex emotional environments in the past, they may become highly calculated in how they present themselves. Every word, every gesture, every reaction becomes slightly measured. This is not fake personality, it is adaptation. The mind learns from trial, error, acceptance, and rejection, and builds strategies to navigate future interactions more safely. And then there are moments when energy shifts unexpectedly. A topic is mentioned, a certain question is asked, or a specific direction is taken in conversation, and suddenly the mood changes. This is where unresolved emotional imprints often surface. Not necessarily pain, but memory stored in emotion. The human mind does not just remember events, it remembers how those events felt. And when something touches an old emotional pattern, the reaction is often instant, even unconscious. A pause, a smile that fades, a sudden seriousness. These are windows into internal experiences that still exist beneath the surface. When you connect all these observations, a deeper understanding begins to form. People are not simple or predictable. They are layered systems of memory, emotion, adaptation, and perception. What you see on the surface is only the most controlled version of who someone is at that moment. The real depth lies in patterns, not statements. And once you start recognizing patterns instead of judging moments, you stop seeing people as mysteries to solve and start seeing them as stories still unfolding. What often goes unnoticed in human behavior is how clearly people reveal their past experiences through their relationship with boundaries. Not the boundaries they talk about, but the ones they react to. In every interaction, whether in friendships, dating, or even casual conversation, there is always a silent negotiation happening around emotional space, personal limits, and respect. And the way someone responds to these invisible lines can quietly reflect how they have been treated before, what they have normalized, and what they unconsciously expect from others. When someone has grown up or lived through experiences where their boundaries were consistently respected, there is usually a natural calmness in how they respond to limits. They do not feel threatened by no. They do not interpret distance as rejection, and they do not rush to break emotional space just to feel secure. Instead, they understand that boundaries are not barriers, but structure. This kind of emotional stability is not taught through words alone. It is learned through repeated experiences of being valued without being overstepped. The nervous system begins to associate respect with safety, and that creates a grounded way of engaging with others. But on the other side, when a person has experienced environments where boundaries were ignored, tested, or inconsistently respected, something different develops. Even if they do not consciously recognize it, their reactions begin to carry traces of that history. Sometimes they may over-explain themselves when a boundary is set. Sometimes they may withdraw suddenly, not because of the present moment, but because the feeling of limitation triggers old emotional memories. And in some cases, they may even test boundaries themselves, not out of malice, but out of familiarity, because unpredictability was once their normal. This is where psychology becomes deeply subtle. People do not just respond to what is happening in front of them, they respond through layers of what has happened before. A simple moment, like someone taking time to reply, setting a small personal limit, or asking for space, can create completely different internal reactions depending on someone's emotional conditioning. For one person, it feels normal and healthy. For another, it may feel uncomfortable, even if nothing objectively wrong is happening. The difference lies not in the present situation, but in the internal blueprint shaped long before this interaction ever began. There is also a pattern where individuals who have experienced blurred or inconsistent boundaries may develop a heightened sensitivity to closeness. They might become very quick to attach, or alternatively, very quick to detach. Both responses come from the same place: uncertainty about emotional safety. When someone does not know what to expect from boundaries, they begin to interpret emotional distance or structure as instability. So they either try to close the gap quickly to regain a sense of control, or they step away entirely to avoid potential discomfort. What looks like unpredictability on the surface is often a coping mechanism underneath. At the same time, some people learn to overcorrect. After experiencing situations where their boundaries were ignored, they may become extremely guarded. Even small emotional requests or simple expectations can feel like pressure. They might appear distant or overly independent, but beneath that is often a protective structure built from earlier emotional lessons. The mind adapts by creating rules. Do not allow too much closeness. Do not depend too heavily. Do not let space be taken without control. These rules are not spoken, but they quietly influence every interaction. What makes this even more complex is that people rarely recognize these patterns in themselves while they are happening. Most individuals believe they are simply being themselves in the moment, not realizing that their reactions are shaped by deeply stored emotional experiences. So when boundaries are involved, misunderstandings often occur. One person may feel disrespected, while the other feels confused about why a normal limit caused such a strong reaction. In reality, both are responding from different emotional histories. If you observe carefully, you will notice that healthy emotional dynamics are often calm in their structure. There is no panic when space is created, no confusion when limits are communicated, and no emotional turbulence when expectations are clear. Instead, there is understanding. This does not mean there is no emotion, it means emotion is not driving instability. The presence of boundaries actually strengthens connection rather than weakening it because both sides feel psychologically safe. Ultimately, how someone responds to boundaries is not just about behavior in the moment. It is a reflection of everything they have learned about safety, trust, and respect over time. And once you begin to understand that, you stop reacting only to what people do and start recognizing the emotional history that quietly shapes how they do it. Silence is one of the most misunderstood elements in human interaction, yet it reveals more about a person than most words ever could. In a world where people are constantly speaking, responding, reacting, and performing, silence feels almost uncomfortable, like something is missing. But psychologically, silence is never empty. It is filled with presence, emotion, thought, and sometimes even truth that words are not ready to carry. When you begin to observe how someone behaves in silence, you start to understand not just their personality, but their inner stability. For some people, silence feels natural. It is not something they rush to escape from, because their mind is already at ease with itself. They do not feel the need to constantly fill every gap in conversation, because their sense of self is not dependent on continuous external validation. In these moments, silence becomes a shared space rather than a problem to fix. There is comfort in simply existing without pressure, without performance, without the need to prove anything. Psychologically, this often reflects emotional grounding, a mind that is not constantly chasing reassurance or stimulation. But for others, silence can feel very different. The absence of words creates tension, not because anything is wrong externally, but because something internal becomes activated. In silence, there is no distraction, and when distraction fades, thoughts become louder. For some individuals, this brings discomfort, even anxiety. They may quickly try to fill the gap with conversation, jokes, opinions, or questions, not because they necessarily have something to say, but because silence itself feels too exposing. It creates a space where they are left alone with their thoughts, and that can feel unfamiliar or even unsettling. This difference is deeply psychological. It is not about intelligence or personality type alone, but about emotional conditioning. People who have spent time in environments where silence was safe, where they were not punished, ignored, or emotionally uncertain during quiet moments, tend to develop a calm relationship with it. On the other hand, those who have experienced emotional unpredictability may associate silence with uncertainty. In such cases, silence does not feel peaceful. It feels like something is about to happen, or something is being withheld. There is also a subtle layer in how silence affects emotional perception in relationships. When two people are comfortable with silence together, it often signals a deeper form of trust. It means there is no pressure to constantly maintain connection through words alone. The relationship is not dependent on continuous validation. Instead, there is a quiet understanding that presence itself is enough. This kind of comfort is not built instantly. It is developed through emotional safety and repeated experiences of non-threatening connection. However, when silence is uncomfortable for one or both individuals, the interaction often becomes mentally exhausting. One person may feel pressured to keep the conversation alive, while the other may feel uneasy when nothing is being said. This creates an invisible imbalance where silence is no longer neutral. It becomes something that needs to be managed. Over time, this can lead to misunderstandings, where silence is interpreted as disinterest, distance, or even emotional withdrawal, when in reality, it may simply be a difference in emotional wiring. What makes silence so powerful is that it removes distraction. Without words, without performance, and without external noise, people are left with their raw internal state. This is why silence can sometimes feel intense. It reflects back what the mind is actually holding in that moment. If someone is internally calm, silence feels expansive and grounding. If someone is internally unsettled, silence can feel heavy, as though it is amplifying thoughts that were previously ignored. In deeper psychological terms, silence acts like a mirror. It does not create emotion, it reveals it. And because of that, people often reveal their emotional regulation patterns most clearly when nothing is being said. Some individuals will naturally settle into it, breathing easier, becoming more present, even more connected. Others will unconsciously try to escape it, filling it as quickly as possible, as though stillness itself is something to avoid. But perhaps the most interesting aspect of silence is that it cannot be faked. Words can be controlled, rehearsed, and shaped to create a certain impression. Silence, however, exposes comfort or discomfort in its purest form. It shows whether a person is at ease with themselves or still learning how to sit with their own thoughts. It shows whether connection is internal or dependent on constant external input. And when you begin to understand silence in this way, it stops being something awkward or empty. It becomes information. Not about what people are saying, but about how they are existing beneath the noise. Because in the end, silence does not hide truth, it slowly reveals it. And sometimes, what is not said speaks the most. Memory is never a perfect recording of reality. It is not a camera that captures life exactly as it happens. Instead, it is a living process, constantly reshaped by emotion, perception, and time. This is why two people can experience the same moment and later describe it in completely different ways, both believing they are right. What we remember is not only what happened, but what our mind decided was important, meaningful, or emotionally significant. In psychology, memory is deeply tied to emotion. The brain does not store every detail equally. It prioritizes feelings over facts. When something emotionally intense happens, the mind highlights certain elements and fades others into the background. Over time, as the memory is recalled again and again, it can subtly shift. Not in a way that is intentional or dishonest, but in a way that aligns more with how the person felt than what objectively occurred. This is why emotional experiences often feel true even when the details are slightly different each time they are retold. This becomes especially clear in interpersonal relationships. When someone shares their past experiences, what they are describing is often filtered through emotional interpretation. A single event may be remembered differently depending on the impact it had. If it caused pain, the memory may become sharper, more detailed, and more emotionally charged. If it brought comfort, it may feel softer and less defined. Over time, these emotional layers shape how the story is told, not to mislead others, but because the mind naturally organizes memory around feeling rather than precision. There is also something called selective recall. The human mind does not access all memories equally. It tends to bring forward the ones that match current emotions. When someone is feeling hurt, they are more likely to remember past situations that also caused hurt. When someone feels safe, they may recall moments of comfort or trust more easily. This creates a shifting internal narrative where the past seems to change depending on the emotional state of the present. It is not the past itself changing, but the lens through which it is viewed. Inconsistent storytelling patterns often emerge from this psychological reality. A person may describe an experience one way in a calm state and slightly differently when emotionally activated. The core meaning remains, but the details may shift. Sometimes the emphasis changes, sometimes the order of events feels different, and sometimes certain parts are highlighted while others are minimized. This does not always indicate dishonesty. In many cases, it reflects how memory is being reconstructed in real time based on emotional cues. What makes this even more complex is that the brain is constantly trying to create coherence. Humans do not like fragmented or unclear narratives. So when memory gaps exist, the mind often fills them automatically. These fillers are not deliberate lies. They are interpretations, assumptions, or reconstructions that feel true enough to complete the story. Over time, these reconstructions can become so integrated that they feel like original memory. In relationships, this can sometimes lead to misunderstandings. One person may recall a situation with emphasis on intent, while the other remembers it based on impact. Both perspectives are shaped by emotional experience, but neither fully captures the entire objective truth. This is why arguments about what really happened are often difficult to resolve. The disagreement is not just about facts, it is about emotional reality. Another subtle layer is how identity influences memory. As people grow and change, they reinterpret their past through the lens of who they have become. A person who values emotional awareness today may look back at their earlier self and remember situations differently than they did at the time. The memory itself is re-edited to align with current understanding. This is part of how humans make sense of their personal story, even if it means reshaping the past slightly to fit the present identity. Despite all of this, memory is not unreliable, it is adaptive. Its purpose is not to preserve perfect accuracy, but to preserve meaning. It helps humans learn, survive, and emotionally process life. Without this flexibility, emotional healing and growth would be much harder because the mind would be locked into fixed interpretations without room for change. So when you notice inconsistencies in how people describe their past, it is worth remembering that you are not seeing deception, you are seeing interpretation. A mind trying to translate experience into language, filtered through emotion, shaped by time, and adjusted by identity. And in that sense, memory is less about what happened and more about how it continues to live within us. There is a subtle difference between confidence that is natural and confidence that has been carefully constructed through experience. At first glance, both can look the same. Both can appear smooth, socially aware, and emotionally composed. But when you observe closely, especially in deeper interactions, you begin to notice that some people are simply being themselves, while others are actively managing how they are perceived. This difference is not always visible in words. It often lives in timing, control, and emotional precision. People who have been shaped by complex social or emotional experiences often learn to become highly aware of how they are presenting themselves. Over time, they begin to understand what gets approval, what creates distance, and what builds connection. As a result, their behavior becomes slightly calibrated, not fake, but refined. Every gesture carries a bit of awareness. Every response has a layer of consideration behind it. This is not necessarily manipulation, it is adaptation, a learned skill developed through repeated social feedback. In psychology, this can be understood as behavioral optimization. When someone has experienced inconsistency in acceptance, being liked in one moment and rejected in another, they may begin to adjust their personality presentation to maintain stability in how others respond to them. They learn what version of themselves is more socially safe. Over time, this can lead to a personality that feels polished, but also slightly guarded. Nothing is random anymore. Everything is subtly filtered. On the surface, this can look like charisma. The person seems composed, socially intelligent, and emotionally controlled. They know how to say the right things, when to pause, when to engage, and when to step back. But beneath that, there is often a constant internal monitoring system running in the background, a quiet awareness of how they are being perceived. This does not mean they are being dishonest. It means their comfort has become tied to predictability in social outcomes. In contrast, people with more unconditioned confidence tend to behave with less calculation. They respond in the moment without overprocessing how it will be received. Their emotional expression is more direct, less edited. This does not make them better or worse. It simply reflects a different internal relationship with social judgment. They are less driven by managing perception and more guided by immediate authenticity. What makes the overcalculated style interesting is that it often develops unconsciously. A person does not wake up one day deciding to become highly controlled in their behavior. It develops gradually through experience, through situations where being too open led to discomfort, or where misinterpretation led to emotional consequences. The mind learns to protect itself by refining expression. Over time, this protection becomes personality. However, there is a cost to this constant self-monitoring. When every interaction is slightly filtered, emotional spontaneity can become reduced. The person may become very skilled at navigating social situations, but slightly disconnected from unstructured emotional expression. They may appear confident, but internally, there can still be a level of effort involved in maintaining that image. The ease is external, the management is internal. This is where the psychology of social learning becomes important. Humans are highly adaptive creatures. We learn quickly what behaviors create acceptance and what behaviors lead to rejection. And once those patterns are learned, they often become automatic. Even without thinking, the mind begins to adjust tone, expression, and presence based on perceived expectations. Over time, this creates a personality that is not just who the person is, but also how they have learned to survive socially. Yet, even in highly composed individuals, small moments can reveal the difference between natural ease and learned control. It may appear as a slight delay before responding, a carefully structured answer when emotion would normally be more fluid, or a subtle awareness of how words might land. These are not flaws. They are indicators of a mind that has become skilled at navigating complexity. The deeper insight here is that confidence is not a single trait. It exists on a spectrum between spontaneity and control, between expression and refinement, between being and managing. And most people move along that spectrum depending on their experiences, environments, and emotional history. So, what looks like personality on the surface is often a strategy underneath. A strategy shaped by past interactions, refined by feedback, and reinforced by memory. And once you begin to see that, you stop interpreting behavior as simple identity and start recognizing it as adaptation in motion. Because in many cases, people are not just expressing who they are expressing what they had to become.